Hello and welcome to Katharine's Creatures. This is a series where we're going to talk a little bit about and touch base upon various mythological beasts, beings, and the like pulled from lore worldwide. And I always like to preface by saying I am not a linguist, so if I mispronounce anything, I do apologize in advance. Hopefully I'm a little closer than not today because I'll be talking about a mythos that I am relatively familiar with because I've spent years researching it for my series, The Guardian Speaker, and this is Norse mythology. And today we'll be talking about the concept of the Alfar, which are the elves of Nordic myth. Now, most people or most translations of text from that era say that there are two races of elves. There's the Alfar, the dark elves, and the Alfar, the light elves. But there is an argument to be made that there may actually be a third race of elves known as the Alfar, which can either be translated the black elves or the swarthy elves. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But most of the concept and the ideas that we know of the elves comes from a particular text by a man called, he was Icelandic, pretty much writer, Snorri Sturluson, and he lived in the 13th century. And of the text that he has become famed for, the one that talks about the elves is the Prose Edda. And in that, he mentions how the Alfar live in one of the 9 realms that's pretty much dedicated for the elves, and this is Alfamir. And the Alfar are described as fairer than the sun, which is very strikingly different from their alternative version, which is the Alfar, the dark elves, which were known to have dark complexions and live within the earth, so almost like subterranean dwellers. Now, here's a question that starts to come to mind when folklorists start considering things. Alfar being described as, again, swarthy and subterranean is very similar to that concept of the dwarves, which were called the Dvugar. Now, the dwarves are known to live in the realm called Nidavellir, which translates to the dark fields. But again, these swarthy, almost subterranean creatures from myth. And that question is, are the Alfar and Dvugar the same thing, just different names, or are they totally different? That question is also brought back up, going back to that mysterious third potential race of elves, the Svaltafar. There are more people who kind of believe that maybe Svaltafar is, again, an alternative name for the dwarves, because, again, they're described as being the black and swarthy, as their translations of their names reflect, and Dvugar were considered to be swarthy, and again, these subterranean entities. So, interesting stuff. Now, going back to that point, but there is a folklorist, his name is Jacob Grimm, and he really advocated that there were 3 separate races of elves, all 3 of them being very different. And Jacob Grimm lived between 1785 and 1863, and he really made that point and pushed for that concept. Some people believed him and have kind of fallen into his mentality. Most still just consider the Alfar and Alfar are the only 2. Now, if you like to think of the Svaltafar as its own particular race, the one text that talks of them also says that they lived in the realm called Svaltafheim, so the land of the Black Elves. But here's the problem. In Norse mythology, there can only be 9 realms, and if you start counting them out, 8 of them are agreed across the board, but that 9th one just depends on which text you've gotten. And all but that one, referencing Svaltafheim, will say that the 9th one instead is Nidavellir, the realm of the dwarves. So it goes back to that question, are they the same thing? And they're just, again, a misunderstanding or mistranslation between various texts and writers throughout time and history, or are they separate? But then how can there be more than 9 realms? Questions to ponder if you really want to deep dive into Nordic myth. But beyond that, the one last thing I wanted to talk about, the concept of elves and Alfar. This is just a fun side note that I love to be able to tuck in whenever possible for people who like naming creatures and entities, and people plus who may like fantasy as well. Because Tolkien, who is very famed with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he loved Norse mythology. Many of his names and concepts that he wrote in his work came from Nordic myth, including this particular fun fact. So Alfar means elf. Gandar, Ganda, is a word that means staff, particularly a staff that was known to be used for the seeresses of that belief system, and they were the ones who could use magic. And so the Gander, this particular staff, was associated with the type of magic setter that was thought to exist in the world and was believed upon by the people during the Viking era. So, fun fact, in Norse mythology, there is a particular section in one text that lists all the names of the dwarves, and it goes on and on and on. And yes, you will find a lot of those names utilized by Tolkien for his dwarves. But one of the ones that always makes me chuckle is Gandalf, because in Norse mythology, Gandalf directly translates to Gandar Alfar, so staff elf. And if you know Gandalf from Tolkien, he is known for his staffs, as are many of the wizards in that world of Middle Earth. So you can kind of see how the inspiration came, but in Norse mythology, the original Gandalf was not a wizard, he was a dwarf. Go figure, fun fact. Anywho, if you have any questions for me about this or anything else, please post them in the comments below or message me on any of my other social media. And until next time, Skål.